Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Criminal Law as a Tool of Authoritarian Control speaker series. My name is Katie Naples Mitchell. I'm moderating today's event. This is part of a series that we've been doing since early in September, and we will continue through December. And you're meeting us at sort of the midway point. So welcome. And if you'd like to watch recordings of earlier events in the series, they will be posted on our website and YouTube page in the days and weeks to come. Thank you all so much for being here. Today's event is on the development of police in the U.S., suppressing and stoking racial and class conflicts, and we're delighted to be featuring speaker Julian Go, a professor at the University of Chicago. I'll give a fuller bio for Julian in a moment. But before I do, I just want to go over some of the kind of procedural functions of how we try to operate this series. So we are in a webinar format, but we do want this to feel like a community and everyone to feel engaged. So feel free to use the chat to share resources or reflections, and most importantly, to share your questions. We will aim to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then leave at least 15 to 20 minutes for questions. This event does go until 5:45 Eastern. At that point, I will kind of go through the questions in the queue in which they were asked and invite people to unmute and ask their own questions directly of the speaker. Again, please feel encouraged to engage throughout the event. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speaker for the day. So Julian Go is professor of sociology at the University of Chicago, where he is also a faculty affiliate in the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Committee on International Relations. He's also a fellow of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory and former president of the Social Science History Association. His research explores the social logics, forms, and impact of empires and colonialism, post-colonial and decolonial thought, and related questions of social theory, epistemology and knowledge, and global historical sociology. And what brings him here today in particular is his work focused on US empire and the historical sociology of policing, including his prize-winning book, Policing Empires, Militarization, Race, and the Imperial Boomerang in Britain and the United States. We are so delighted to have you here, Julian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So to begin, we often like to start with some theoretical underpinnings. And I think one critical insight in your work in this most recent book is fundamentally there is bleed between what is considered civil or civilian and what is militarized in modern police forces. So I figured let's start with, what does the term militarization mean to you? And how does it relate to sort of modern incarnations of the police? Is it a process? Is it a culture? How should we understand that term?
Yeah, that's a crucial question. One way to answer that is to talk a little bit about the background to the book, because the book is really all about this. I had been writing and researching various aspects of the US empire for a long time. But around 2014, with the emergence of Black Lives Matter protests and then Standing Rock, I became really fascinated with what was called the militarization of police, because you had, of course, on the streets of Ferguson or in Standing Rock, you had these, fully armed forces, police forces, with military gear and MRAPs and so on, facing down civilians, and the press was talking about this. And there were some interesting books by some really good journalists on militarization. So I became interested in this. And one of the things I learned when I started digging into the history, because I am a historical sociologist, I'm always curious about, how did we get here? And that was really the key to sort of triggering my investigations that led to this book. So as I looked into this question of, how we got here, I was looking at the literature, and it turns out that, for those of you who don't know anything about policing like me initially, the United States and Britain go by this traditional model of policing called the civil police, right? Before 1829, when the London Metropolitan Police was formed, there was really no police as we know it in England or the United States. For those of you who know this history, excuse me, I'm assuming some people don't know this history. But before that 1829 forming of the London Metropolitan Police, there was really no police departments as we know them. And so the London Metropolitan Police inaugurated this model of a full-time, professionalized police department. And it was known as the civil police because the people who created it, Sir Robert Peel and his allies and colleagues in England, wanted it to be a civilian force controlled by civilian authorities and not subject to military control and not really militarized. And his model here was two things that he would, well, his what he wanted to differentiate the London Metropolitan Police from was A, the British Army on the one hand, and before the police of London, you had to call on the army for strikes and riots and disorder. And so Peel didn't want that. And on the other hand, what you had on the continent, based upon the French model, was the gendarmerie. That is, these police that were actually branches of the military, and these were fully militarized units, and they were controlled by the military. Peel didn't want that either. So he came up with this idea of the civil police, which again, the idea being that rather than call on the military, rather than have a militarized force like the gendarmerie, you'd have civilian, full-time professional police controlled by civilians. Now, what militarization means is essentially a deviation from that model, or that's the way scholars have talked about it. There's probably lots of different ways we could define militarization. For me, I've relied on Peter Kraska and some of his colleagues' definition. Peter Kraska is a criminologist at Kentucky, I believe. And they define militarization as the adoption by the police of military materials, military organizational principles, military operations, military forms, military cultures. And so what people were talking about after 2014 up through the, even through 2020, when they said the militarization of police, I think they were really referring to this process of the police drawing from or modeling themselves after the army, using military grade weapons. And most of the press was talking about the use of military grade weapons and tools. But in Kraska's definition, and I think it's a very important, useful definition, militarization also includes the adoption of military tactics for policing, military mindsets, military cultures. And so that's essentially what I mean by militarization, and that's essentially what everyone was talking about when they talked about militarization. The United States police are militarized, right? They adopt all of these military mindsets, not just uniforms and not just the weaponry, but also military tactics and tools. And of course, in many cases, not in all, but personnel, right? Military former soldiers. But what's crucial to militarization is that it doesn't have to be personnel, right? It's all about the sort of military mindsets and other organizational and tactical aspects of the military. I kind of went off on a tangent there. Sorry.
That's perfect. That's not a tangent. That's absolutely perfect. And I think, that gets to, right, the question is in some way just an opportunity for you to talk about that sort of overall framework for the book, right? And for the kind of threads in this scholarship. But I think what's useful about what you've said so far is, right, it is both specific strategies and tactics and this kind of culture and acculturation process, right? And I think what that reveals and really what your scholarship reveals is, right, like this is sort of a false construct, the idea of the civilian police in a certain way where there are these elements of these police forces and agencies that were all imported from the military to begin with. So I think it might be useful for us to dig into some of that kind of history together. And your research finds that colonial forces served as a model for the London Metropolitan Police and for early police forces in the US in places like New York and Boston and Savannah. And even as these were supposedly civil institutions, right, they borrowed heavily from these structures and logics of colonial rule through military force specifically. And so I wonder if you could give us some of the kind of like nuts and bolts of how this is reflected in these early police agencies, right? Were these symbolic and procedural similarities, like you mentioned uniforms or kind of structured hierarchy, or to what extent this affected the sort of substance of what was policed, who was policed, the kind of behavior that drew police attention, the kind of tactics the police deployed, and the technologies they used in response.
Yeah, great. That's a key question too. And I appreciate that you pointed out from the beginning that this distinction between the civil and military is in many ways a false separation. So what's really, it's a very complicated thing because on the one hand, there is a separation. I mean, the invention of the civil police model, the London Metropolitan Police in 1829, then other departments in England were created, and then it got on a ship and came to the US and New York, Savannah, all these other cities adopted it, and that's what we have today. What all of this creation of modern police departments meant was that we had this distinction between the civil and the military. And that is a real distinction in the sense that, the US Army is for enemies abroad, right? And the police are for domestic law enforcement. And there is this jurisdiction, and legal scholars, of course, will know this quite well. And there's all these legalities to it that I'm not an expert on. But this is a real distinction. On the other hand, what militarization is getting at is the way in which police, even though they're doing domestic law enforcement and they're not doing the functions of the military overseas, the way in which they adopt these military things. And basically, let me give you just two brief key arguments to get at your question. One, militarization is not something that is new. And this is something that scholars had assumed, and I think the journalists assumed, that militarization is relatively new. People were talking about the various programs like the LISO program in the 1990s, by which local police departments could get military surplus equipment as the kind of beginnings of real militarization. People talk about the war on drugs or how the war on terror, brought more of a militarization, and those are all true. But what those sort of suggest is that militarization is relatively new. In fact, one of the key arguments is that militarization is evident from the very beginning. So when Peel created the London Metropolitan Police, it was already militarized, even though he was calling it a civil police. Secondly, what journalists, what scholars might call militarization, I would argue, is actually not the exact thing going on. And here's where we get to your point about colonialism. Militarization, I would argue, is really an effect of what I call the imperial boomerang. That is, a process by which actors in the United States and Britain start importing forms, tools, tactics, ideas that were developed and used in the colonies, or being developed and being used in the colonies, and then bringing back home. And militarization then is not quite the exact word. The militarization of the police is really the kind of colonialization of the police. Because what I find from this research is, from the founding of police departments, from the London Metropolitan Police to the founding of the Savannah Police and New York Police, from the founding of the police departments up to the present, we've had various moments or waves of what looks like militarization, but is really the adoption of colonial tactics and tools. When the London Metropolitan Police was formed, Sir Robert Peel, who it was his brainchild, he had actually been a colonial governor in Ireland, and there Ireland had already had, by the British, all kinds of police forces, as we'd call them. They're essentially militaristic and military units, counterinsurgency units, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, the force that Peel created, called the Peel's Preservation Force, which was actually a rural militarized force to suppress insurgencies, and later became the Royal Irish Constabulary. All of these colonial coercive institutions existed already before the London Metropolitan Police. They existed all around the colonial world. You had slave patrols and militia in the US South, and originating, remember, not in the United States or what is the present United States, but in British slaveholding areas like Jamaica. So you had all these kind of quasi-policing forces or policing forces. And when Peel then goes to London and creates the London Metropolitan Police after serving in Ireland, he deliberately models the London Metropolitan Police after these colonial forces. And one of the key models was the Dublin Metropolitan Police, and again, this force that would later be known as the Royal Irish Constabulary. That's where Peel gets the idea of a military hierarchy. The forces were already organized in the colonies as a military hierarchy. And when we talk about the police today, we completely take it for granted that there's a thing called a sergeant and a military hierarchy in policing. But this was a deliberate creation. And Peel, when he created it, was thinking of the colonial forces that had these police forces that were already militarized and had a military hierarchy. Command and control was centralized in the Home Office in England. This was also modeled after the way in which police forces were organized in the colonies. The watchman and constable system that had existed before the founding of the police, that was all localized, it was all parish-based. And so this centralized command and control system is also a militarized system, but it really came from the colonies. There's various tactics too. The very idea of a beat patrol comes from the militia slave patrols in the British Caribbean. Some of the people that helped create the London Metropolitan Police that Peel brought in were expressly from Ireland, and they had colonial military background. So when the founding of the police, as we know it today, um, when that happened, it was always already a kind of militarized form, but really more precisely a colonial form. And that's why I call it a boomerang effect. This is the tactics and forms that were very novel at the time in many ways, that are developed in the colonies, then come home, and founding of police is a good example of that.
Yeah, that's so helpful for kind of teeing up then the next set of questions as we kind of dive into. You talk about these um, sort of like periods of sort of recurrent moments of militarization, right? And you know, one of the other areas of kind of the imperial boomerang that you researched was sort of looking at um, the sort of reformist era, right? The modernization era in the United States in the 20th century, and the development of tactics, specific tactics that you say also, right? You kind of trace the history of where these came from, colonial enterprises. So I wondered if you could give us a couple of examples. You know, you write about so many different great examples like pin mapping and the use of tear gas and fingerprinting. And in particular, you also note that some of, and you've already sort of previewed this, but I think the specific stories are really evocative of the specific individuals, right, who had been involved in those colonial projects and then came back to the United States and brought these tactics that they had been developing and employing in those settings into local police forces. So, you know, one of the examples in your book is a Volmer who had served in the Philippines and later became chief of police in Berkeley. That's a lot of ground to cover, but you know, pull from what you would like to talk about.
Yeah, it is a key argument in my book that after the founding of the police departments, that was sort of one wave of militarization, which again was really just a colonialization. Um, it's funny because when I first started writing about this, I did use the term, instead of militarization, colonialization, and it's rightfully awkward. And all the reviewers said you can't use that term. That's just ridiculous. So I had to use it. But I'm going to
Well,
use
I
it
like
here.
that we're getting back to, yeah, that's right. It's the
Yeah,
truthful
yeah.
nugget within the
Yeah, yeah,
story,
yeah.
right?
Screw reviewer B. I'm going to use that here. But yeah, so it was really a colonization, but there are all these other moments, intense moments, intensified moments of what looks like militarization, but is really colonialization. In Britain, you have these various moments. In the US, you have these various moments. And one moment I think it's probably good to talk about is the one you brought up, which is in the late 19th century, early 20th century, police departments around the US, they had already been founded. But what they did in this period is they started professionalizing and modernizing, using new criminal investigation techniques. They did things like create new mounted units, right? These mounted patrols. Before this time, officers would really go on their, beats. They just hang out in their neighborhoods. But these mounted patrols, first on bicycles and then horses, and then of course now cars. They would move around the city, and they could just go around, and they'd have their own patrol, but there was this ability to go from place to place really quickly and everybody to gather really quickly. This was also new, these mounted units. I think New York created its mounted unit in 1917, or actually a little bit earlier. So there was a lot of these techniques. Another technique was pin mapping. So basically all of these techniques, and also new training methods. I can't forget training methods, but what many police departments around started doing is they started saying, look, we need to train our officers in regular military drills, and gun, shooting drills and so on. And so really have this militarized training. This was also part of this kind of professionalization movement. So all of this was happening in the US across police departments, late 19th century and early 20th century. Historians today call this the professionalization movement, or the modernization era of policing. But really, as I show in the book, and one of the things I found from my research is that this is actually a moment of militarization, or really the imperial boomerang. One of the key fellows is exactly the person you mentioned. His name's August Vollmer. He is known as the father of modern policing. He's a very important figure because he, in many ways, is considered to have invented, or at least perfected and popularized, many of these new innovations. And if you talk to police officers today, I've actually done an informal survey. Ever since I first heard of him, I meet a police officer at the park or something, off duty, or even just chatting with a friend of a friend. I'd say, "Do you know this guy, August Vollmer?" And they say, "Oh yeah, of course, he's in my textbook." So he's a very popular figure because he was chief of police first in Berkeley, in the early 1900s. And then he was so popular for all his innovations and methods that he then was brought into LA in the 1920s to be chief there and to bring his methods there. And then he consulted Minnesota, Chicago, all these people. He had a bunch of uh, uh, students under him because what he did at Berkeley, he was so popular that he created Berkeley's first criminology program and police training academy at Berkeley. And he had all these students working under him and studying with him, including one who became chief of police in Chicago, Orlando Wilson, a bunch of people, actually, many people trained under him. So he was this very important figure, but he was also a veteran of the Philippine-American War. Of course, those of you who, just a little reminder, the United States had these colonies. One of them was the Philippines in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And the Filipino rebellion was this rebellion against American control. Vollmer had served in the counterinsurgency forces in the American Army, the U.S. Army, that was sent to suppress these insurgencies from Filipinos. And he brought back many of the methods and then applied them to policing. And his express sort of explicit theory for policing was it should adopt military tactics and tools. That was one of his key principles. And the military tactics and tools, of course, that he was familiar with and that he adopted and applied to policing were from his colonial experience in the Philippines in this sort of this war of conquest and counterinsurgency war. Various techniques. One is the one you mentioned, pin mapping. Pin mapping was really popularized through Vollmer in this period. This was where police departments, after they collect data on where crimes occurred in the city, and you have to remember, police really didn't collect good data. This was part of this new professionalization and modernization movement. But they would collect data on where the crimes occurred in the city, and then they would put pins in the neighborhoods or the location of where that crime had occurred, and then that could guide where they would direct their new mobile units and mobile forces and sort of saturate and patrol those areas. This did not fall from thin air. Vollmer got it from the military experience. The military had, in fact, been responsible for really innovating pin mapping techniques, and throughout its campaigns, and in the Philippines in particular, they innovated and perfected this. They would use intelligence to try to hunt down and track where the insurgents were, where their camps were, and then they would use that information to mount their search and destroy missions and their various attacks and raids on insurgent camps. Vollmer just brought this back, sort of reconfigured criminals, reconfigured Filipino insurgents as criminals, and reconfigured the terrain of Berkeley and LA and other cities as the colonial terrain, and used pin mapping there. Today, this technique is commonly used. It's just used with computers. It's called predictive policing or spot map policing. But it's the same principle, and Vollmer adopted it, and Vollmer brought it from his colonial experience. Just one example among many of the kinds of colonial counterinsurgency tactics that are brought home. These tactics that are often invented and perfected in the colonies or the peripheries of empire, such as Vietnam, and that these come home. Another example is, what happened in the early 20th century is that some police departments were found to be torturing suspects using what was called the water cure, where they pour water, hold the suspect down, they pour water over their mouth until the suspect confesses. We know this today. A certain variant of it is waterboarding from the Iraq War, but it really was used by police on suspects in the early 20th century, largely, of course, racial minorities. And there's a whole race story here that we can get into later. But this was also a tactic that the U.S. Army had used in the Philippines. They used it on insurgents to collect information and intelligence on where the insurgents were. And they just brought that, then police brought that back to the United States and used it. Of course, here in Chicago, we had a later example of military torture techniques used by John Burge and other police officers here in Chicago. Burge was a Vietnam veteran. They were using these various shock treatments and various horrible torture techniques in Vietnam, and many of them veterans brought them back when they became police officers. So we have this constant, I would say, importation, right, of techniques and tactics developed in the imperial periphery or in the colonies and brought back.
Yeah, and just to kind of sharpen that point a little bit, it's not I think what's so important about both of the examples you just gave is it's not just that it's sort of a tactic that was observed elsewhere and being imported, right? It's like the same people who were functioning as the foot soldiers of empire or in leadership roles in these military operations abroad, right, directly brought those tactics back, which I think I wonder if, and you brought up police training, right, about how that process kind of shapes police culture and police training in this sort of generational way, right? And in the case of the tactics you just mentioned, I mean, I think this may be common knowledge, but I feel it's important to state explicitly that not only are they torture and inhumane, they're also counterproductive. They produce false confessions, the kind of panoply of wrongful convictions that came out of the Burge case, right? And the reparations and the specific fantastic ordinance that was passed in Chicago through the leadership of directly impacted communities, right? To try to find redress for those really pervasive harms that were woven throughout the policing institution, even though they were traced specifically to Burge, right? There were other people involved. So I think that point is worth spending a moment with, right? That it's not just that it's kind of these tactics that were observed elsewhere and sort of in an experimental way brought here. It was that these same actors were involved in that process, right?
Yeah, so you have both. So the way I think about it, and that's a really important point, you have both the actors, but you also have the cultures, and the kind of they can be separate. And I think it's important to recognize that because I do think, there are police officers who are veterans who recognize that this is a different, to their credit, they'll recognize this difference. But the problem is the larger system and the culture. And one of the things one of the things that my research implies is that this culture is deep, right? It's not just something that can be fixed with like an anti-bias training session or something like, there's a whole story about racialization here that is crucial. And it's tied to the importation of these tactics. In other words, what I show in the book is that when the London Metropolitan Police was formed, when Vollmer's adopting these tactics, they weren't just sort of playfully adopted. Oh, let's see what happens. They were expressly imported amidst concerns by officials and white publics in the United States and in Britain that they needed to have some kind of new tactics because there was a threat, a rise in crime and disorder. Usually there was some kind of perceived crime wave or fear of disorder that prompted or triggered this importation of techniques. And they were always racialized, right? So in Vollmer's case, it was this fear of these Chinese opium gangsters. In London Metropolitan Police, that was the concern over the Irish migrants who had been coming in. And in all of these cases, there was a kind of perceived racialized threat, the sense that, okay, well, there are these people who are, who in the minds of officials and white publics are almost racially intrinsically inferior and who are criminal. I mean, this was the discourse of the Irish by the British. The claims that the Irish were not only racially inferior, but the racial inferiority meant a cultural inferiority, which also meant an inability to understand and comprehend the law. And this was a common colonial discourse all around, from the Philippines to British India, the sense that these people just don't understand anything but force. And so, of course, the way to deal with them is by force. And so when you import these tactics and techniques, you import this military hierarchy. I would also argue, while people themselves involved are an important part of the story, the whole culture and mentality gets imported, which is what? Which is a sense that criminals are necessarily, criminals are subhuman, right? And this is the idea. There's also a kind of counterinsurgency mentality that like anyone or anybody that you encounter could be a insurgent, i.e. a terrorist, and they're going to kill you at any moment. So you always have to be on guard. So all of these cultures, all these mentalities, I think, are baked into the very heart of policing institutions as we know it. From the beginning, from the very structure of the police department to all its tactics and personnel, there is this culture, this militaristic, I would argue, colonial culture that's racialized, that's coercive and violent, or that at least thinks that violence and coercion is the way to solve problems. So there's a deep culture here. And again, one of the things that my book taught me, which I didn't really know, is that this is a history that goes back to these institutions of policing. They they have this mentality built into it from the very beginning, and they're just constantly reproduced. And so that's what I mean when I say, like, anti-bias training isn't going to fix this, like 1 hour session or whatever a month. Even getting different personnel isn't going to fix this, because it's the culture, it's the system, it's the institution.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to spend a moment with. And I think it's helpful also. I mean, you kind of answered the next question I had prepared, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But I think, critics of sort of critical scholars of policing sometimes come from a specifically economic lens, or sometimes from a specifically race lens or critical race theory kind of lens, thinking about that policing targeted workers specifically, or movements of progressive dissent, or specifically people of color and non-white workers, and growing out of slave patrols in one part of the history of certain police agencies, right? And all of that is true, but I think what your theory kind of knits together in a different way, right, is that you take this a step further, and your work on imperialism sort of underscores that policing is about subjugation. And you talk about kind of the global color line, right? That policing is driven by both race and class, but also dominion over a population that is deemed inherently inferior. And so I guess just to bring us into the present a little bit, I wonder how that framework helps us sort of understand policing more wholly, and in particular, how policing as an institution, or police agencies, law enforcement agencies as institutions, can be weaponized by the state in particular ways, and in particular may be vulnerable to authoritarian leaders.
Yeah, the fun stuff. Let me get it this way. So, one of the interesting things is that when Peel first created the London Metropolitan Police, um, and when the New York City Police was created, for example, and when these police departments were first founded, actually most of the white publics, the middle class, they were hesitant, because no one wants, a police. They, England, they thought of the French secret police. They were like afraid of militarism, and rightfully so. But Peel was able to pull it off anyways. And in the United States, they created these departments. And I would argue, and again, based on the work in the book, I would argue it's because initially, when these police departments are formed, or later when these waves of militarization happen, and these um, forces, these militarized tactics or weaponry are adopted, it's because the white publics assume it's not for them, it's for the racialized populations. And that's why London Metropolitan Police directed most of its early attention towards the Irish. It's why you have this disproportionate racialized policing. And initially, I think white publics thought, okay, I can live with this because it's for them, and actually it's to protect us. We're going to import these militarized tools to protect us from these threats that are coming from these racialized, marginalized communities, many of them migrant, immigrant communities, racialized nonetheless, or racialized through and through. And so what I argue, I think one of the things I'd argue is that this racialization of populations becomes or this turning them into subhuman criminals, deserving of militaristic force and deserving of militaristic tactics. This is a Trojan horse by which is snuck in these militarized methods. The thing is, the militarized methods, weapons, techniques, once they're in, and they are modular. They can then be applied to any populations, and that's exactly what happened with the history of policing. Initially, the London Metropolitan Police was concerned about the Irish. They used these tactics on the Irish. They then started using them on white workers, right? Same in the United States. After Vollmer imported these techniques, actually one of his first major campaigns was against the Chinese opium dens, as they were called. But then that same police force could be used against striking workers, or later students. So one thing here to keep in mind is that this racialization, which is the justification for bringing in militarization, again, it's a Trojan horse, because these techniques, this is the second point, are modular, and the weaponry is modular. Like the gun is racialized at first, and it's brought in when it was brought in by U.S. police or British police, but it's can be used on anybody. And that's the real thing that I think happens with policing as an institution, right? Is that it can then be used on anybody. And so when I start thinking about some of the more recent things going on, I mean, there's a lot to talk about, and it's live, and it's sort of ongoing. And when I think about how what I found in the past informs the present, one of the things is this repetition of history. I mean, when I look at the language of justification for dealing with student protesters by these military forces. By the way, at Columbia, the main unit that suppressed the student protesters was called the Strategic Response Group, which was a tactical unit, which was also what the earlier incarnation was something called the Tactical Patrol Force, which in 1968 also shut down the student Columbia protests, in that case against the Vietnam War. But that force was created in the late 1950s, and it was a direct import from the colonial scene where they had these tactical mobile units already. This is like pre-SWAT, but it is a kind of SWAT unit. And in the colonial world, these were the ways in which police forces operated, these small, heavily militarized elite forces that were then used to saturate neighborhoods of crime or to be sent out to deploy protesters. So that suppression of protesters, there's a direct line backwards to the colonies. And of course, how is it justified? It's justified by the protesters are terrorists, right? Which also carries a racialized component. How is the use of these heavily armed ICE agents walking the streets of like the suburb, like out on the street here? I'm here in Lakeshore, Chicago, beautiful Lakeshore. You're walking the street. It's justified because immigrants are criminals and criminals are going to kill you, right? I mean, why do they need these guns and this whole militarized? It's all justified racially. And again, that is a repeat of these previous waves of militarization. And I would argue that I think there's a strong case to be made that the very figure of the criminal that we have, as someone who is not fully human, as someone who is irrational, as someone who can only understand force, as someone who is not restitutable or fixable, right? That I would argue a strong part of that, and the way in which it operates in the United States and Britain, is the colonial invention. It comes from the colony. It's not solely colonial, but it's a colonial invention, and it's part of this whole process of what we call militarization. So I am very concerned about the way in which the suppression of protests, student protests, the suppression of any protest, the way in which they get coded in these kind of counterinsurgent ways, and this label and these labels. So these are really important. The way in which they're coded and labeled, coded, is really important for justifying this use of militarized colonial tactics. And the same thing with immigrants. It's the criminalization, not only criminalization, but the subhumanization and the assumption that they're gonna kill ICE somehow. This is really scary, and it justifies what's going on. Now, ICE as a whole, like we can talk about ICE as a militarized force. It's not police force, it's a federal force and so on. We can talk about Trump, talking about deploying the National Guard. But like at base, these are some of the things that I think about and that I think my book is sort of directly connected to.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I want to spend another moment on what you just talked about, right? You talked specifically about the way that you see these groups that, one, came out of a colonial history, and two, though, also the strategic response groups not only are those kinds of departments, units, within police agencies across the country, right? Not only in New York City, but across the country, have also notoriously been some of the places with the most civil rights complaints, right? With some of the most violence and investigated by the DOJ in pattern and practice investigations. And typically that results in the unit being sort of dismantled and refabricated and given a new name, perhaps, and then still doing the same functions in new settings. And so I think that mutability of the tactic is worth us thinking about, and also I think what's helpful about your work is it makes the connections really directly between the policing of neighborhoods and the policing of protest movements and movements of dissent, right? And often our political rhetoric can really separate that and think about there's this one kind of policing that's about crime prevention, and then there's this other kind of policing that's about tamping down disorder. And your work seems to see an obvious through line, right, between those there's connective tissue there. And sometimes it's literally the same units that are doing those enforcement efforts. But I think that also, tells us something about how police populations can build power together to counter these forms of policing. So I wondered if you could, I think that's another thing that looking towards history can do. And we talked about this a little bit last week with your colleague Stuart Schrader, who was our speaker last week, right? Of thinking about how does this unpacking of history help us in the modern era of thinking about how do you respond to these kinds of aggressive deployments or the kind of policing of neighborhoods that we see.
I'm gonna say that Stewart probably I would love to hear what he said about this, because he's really, I think he really knows. I would say he knows better than I, but or he has really great, I think, thoughts on this stuff. And on this stuff, I mean, what are the implications of this? Let's face it, dry academic work, or as my son calls it, a long, boring book. Like, what are the implications for thinking about politics today, or this movement? And I'm sure Stuart has a lot of things to say. I'm sure many other people can take what they want from my book and probably have a lot more interesting things to say than I, because I'm not. I don't have any sort of specific concrete things, except to say I will say a couple things. Let me see. I'll say three things. One of the things that the history suggests is that, of course, we need to recognize that that the struggles have to be intersectional, right? Um, that because the tactics and forms, and today the same sort of military technology, militarized industry, policing industry. This is a transnational industry that goes all around the world, to the Middle East and so on. It's the same industry, the same people, same tactics, and that's being used on Palestinians just as it's used on American students by the same formation, same power formation, just as it was back in the colonial era, right? The Philippines and African American populations or Chinese populations. It's the same transnational apparatus that impacts all of these populations. So yeah, point A, we have to think more globally, and by globally, I also mean like think about all the different groups that are impacted by policing, and also that includes, of course, not just marginalized groups, but recognize that the struggle against coercive militarized policing should be a concern for white upper class folks just as much as for racialized minorities, just as much for immigrants, just as much for people overseas. This is all part of the same apparatus of power, and we have to recognize the connectedness of our exposure to power. So that's point one. What that means concretely in terms of organizing, I leave that up to the organizers, but it's something that I think it's a mind shift that we need to take, and I know that many people have already taken it. The second thing I really want to highlight here is that the struggles against police violence and this all of these horrible militarized police actions also has to be an ideological struggle, because again, what justifies the use of these tactics, what justifies the importation, is imagery, stereotypes, racism, right? About immigrants, about criminals. All of these, I think, very wrong, just blatantly wrong stereotypes of student protesters being terrorists and all criminals being necessarily violent and inferior, and immigrants being criminals, and so on and so on. This is all an ideological apparatus that justifies and legitimates this colonialization, and we need to fight at that level too, right? We need to work at the ideological level, and counter these stereotypes, counter these assumptions, counter the false information. Finally, in terms of concrete struggles, and I do think that the old saying of local struggles is the way to begin. For example, one of the interesting concrete movements against the kind of militarized and colonialization that I've seen is how some smaller cities, well, I'm really thinking of is it North Carolina? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the where University, what town is University of Virginia in? I'm sorry. Remember? Does anybody know?
I
Okay,
wish I knew, but
Charlottesville.
I can look. Charlottesville. There we go.
Charlottesville. I believe it's no, it's Durham. I'm sorry. That's where Duke is. The city council voted to not send their police officers for training in Israel. Now, this is part of another wave that I talk about, a more recent wave. In the past 20 years, we've been sending police to Israel to do all these training, and that's a whole different story. But it's part of the larger story that I tell. And the city council was able to do that. Here in Chicago, I'm really seeing the power of local. We saw the power of local action in Minneapolis because the police are ultimately local. Again, that's not dealing with ICE and the federal forces, but the police themselves are local, and so a lot of the action has to happen at the local level. And the federal level and the relationship between local and federal is a very complex, and we have to think about strategically what that means. And I'm not sure exactly what my book would say about that, but I think that the localized struggle against militarization is where we need to start, just given the reality of the fact that policing, law enforcement is not really federal as much as it is local. And so despite the global and imperial expanse of this process that I'm talking about, and despite the fact that we have to think globally, again, the old saying, think globally, act locally, really applies here in this case for all kinds of important reasons. So those are a few of the things I would say.
Phenomenal answer for someone who said he had no answer initially. So I have, we've got plenty more to say, but we've got questions already populating the chat. So I'm going to ask one more and then I'll turn it over to the audience. So if folks have questions coming in, please feel free to keep putting them in. One of the technologies you discuss in the book is fingerprinting. And that one of the outgrowths of that technology that we're currently seeing in the field is that when people are fingerprinted, their biometric data is entered into a national database, which has been one of the primary ways that ICE has been alerted to people who have been arrested, even in localities that do not have 287G agreements, right, that are not actively participating in trying to alert ICE to people's documentation status. So one of the themes of our series is trying to kind of unpack and explore how the turn toward authoritarianism builds upon existing punishment bureaucracy. And in turn, how addressing authoritarian enforcement might entail a much bigger project of dismantling or curtailing existing structures and institutions in law enforcement and the criminal legal system more broadly. So this is a huge question, but I'm going to ask it and then just see what moves you. What would you say about how this imperial history of policing illustrates and forecasts how far these tentacles can extend? I doubt when they invented fingerprinting in the colonies, they thought this will be useful for immigration enforcement in the future 200 years from now, right? But I think part of that legacy we're seeing in these really profound human ways right now. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, fingerprinting is an interesting, right? It started in India, and then the British started using it for policing, and I argue as a kind of part of its anti-Semitism sort of fear of Jewish immigrants. What's interesting, just remember, fingerprinting is a technology. And so I immediately put it in the realm of technologies today that militaries use, and then police import and also use. This gang database, right? That was originally developed military. All these things, all these technologies. So I think one way to think about this is to really recognize the way in which military technologies are adopted and used by the police, and how deeply we're sold on it all the time. I mean, local police departments are spending lots of money for these things. And in terms of politics, we control the local police departments, right? So, but no one's stopping them from doing this. No one's stopping them from adopting these technologies. And because we think, these good technologies are going to help us stop crime, without really recognizing that what really has been happening is the adoption of all these techniques and tools that are then can be used for authoritarianism, should that be the case. So the authoritarian infrastructure is already there, and the most we can do is to try to stop it from going any further. That's one kind of answer. And so I am really anti this technology stuff. It's just it's snake oil, AI and all this stuff that police are heralding as like the new stuff. It's just it's a lot of snake oil. We got to fight that whenever we can, and fight the don't believe the hype, right? These are authoritarian tools. That sounds a little libertarian of me and like little anarchist of me, but I think it's real. It's what's going on. Does that maybe there's some other parts to your question there that I'm
No,
not.
that's a great answer, and I think it's a perfect place for us to pause and open the floor up to others. Our first question that we got in the chat was from Josh Dankoff, but I think Josh had to leave. So I'm gonna skip his question, and then we can come back to it at the end if there aren't enough questions to fill the time, just to make sure that people who are still here can unmute and ask their questions. So our next question came from Jack Collins. Jack, I'm gonna allow you to talk, and you can unmute and ask your question directly.
I wasn't really ready for that. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
I apologize. I get called off during the early part. I joined in the beginning today, then I get called off, but I think I've heard quite a bit. Obviously, I can tell you've done a lot of thinking and review of history of all this. Um, Seems to me that two things. Many of the concerns you have are rightly directed to some of the larger cities that may or may not reflect the majority of police departments around the country. The majority of police departments have between 20 and 50 police officers, and those people there have been learning for decades the value of community policing. These are the kind of people who are spending their time, coaching little league and worrying about how they make ends meet and run a family. So the idea of going to Israel and learning militaristic tactics doesn't really apply to the vast majority of them. So I'm just wondering if you've noticed in your review of history whether any of the emphasis we've made in policing for the last couple of decades on community policing and things like that has made a difference, or is it your position that basically the culture is so corrupt and militaristic that there's nothing you can do about it?
That's a great question. I will say that one of the things I was struck by this Israeli Johns is how many small town police officers were going. Um, I don't know, we consider Springfield small town, but Haverhill, Massachusetts. I mean, these police officers were going to Israel and training. And after 9/11, I don't know how familiar you might be more familiar with this than I, but after 9/11, even small town police departments got trained in all kinds of counter terrorist techniques because the fear was national based about terrorism. But that aside, I think community policing has been one of the models that um, we try and use, and even big cities have tried to use them. Maybe small cities do them, but there's a sense in which that is also from counterinsurgency tactics that we can bracket that. I think that we have, for the most part, gone away from community policing. And again, I think even the small towns are, the police. I don't know, I guess it depends on how small they are, but I'm from a pretty small town in Michigan, and the police originally, and every time I go back, I'm still struck by how militarized the police are. And so I don't have much faith in these other sort of policing forms that don't really get at the institution of policing at all, right? So I'm really more about institutional and systemic change rather than like just finding new forms for policing, because I think for me, in the bigger scope of things, in the big history, what we have decided as a society is that the way to deal with criminality is by putting more money into policing. That's what we've decided to do. And so I personally don't like the idea of community policing because it takes away from putting money into social programs and other ways to deal with, basically youth and people who grow up to be criminals. So, I mean, maybe this is my sociologist talking, but I think just as a society, any solution um, that any way to solve crime and so on through policing as an institution, I'm immediately skeptical of, because it just means that more money is going to go to the police and less money is going to go to these other things. Now, if there's a way to we can fund all of these things, great, but it's a zero-sum game. And what we as Americans have decided to do is fund billions and billions and billions of dollars into policing, community or otherwise, and rather than in social programs and having a proper welfare state and so on and so on.
Thanks for your question, Jack, and thanks for your answer, Julian. Our next question from the audience comes from Hector Soto. Hector, I'm allowing you to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It's raised a lot of other questions, but in terms of the continuing militarization, colonialization of the police, does it matter or impact that we have a Constitution and the Bill of Rights that sets up a legal framework which in some ways can be used to impose change in police departments or law enforcement?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, all of these, I'm not a legal scholar, but as an observer, I just think all of these laws and things, it's all the proof is in the pudding. The thing about police is that they have this, they have discretion, what's called discretionary power. Police on the ground decide which laws and when they're gonna listen to or not. And they have an immense amount of power to do that. So, I'm just not, I would like to think that things like the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and other laws matter, but I think they matter much less than we have been accustomed to believe. And I think that people who have been subjected to police violence, I think many of us today are witnessing what's going on, are, these people, people I've listened to, they understand that the law is not what we are, been taught to believe it is. Again, largely because the police have so much discretionary power. It's not a very happy answer. It's not a very positive answer, but I think that's the reality of it.
Thank you.
I'll just add, as a lawyer who does a lot of work on Fourth Amendment cases locally in Massachusetts and equal protection cases, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to an article by a colleague, Eliza Bloom, who's a law professor here at Northeastern, about whack-a-mole reasonable suspicion. And so, the way that typically, that the courts set boundaries around what the police can or cannot do is through individual criminal cases. So it's only the cases that actually ripen into criminal charges that the courts even see to offer whether what the police have done is constitutional or not. And when that happens, then they rely on the police invocation of their training and experience to define kind of what is reasonably criminal without any empirical basis for whether that actually is a behavior that is more likely to be associated with a person carrying contraband or anything like that, And that's part of what gets manufactured in police trainings also, is that there become these little industries of trainings that then recapitulate, here are words you can use to describe certain kinds of behavior that sound professional or professionalized. And so it's kind of this additional layer on top of the sort of professionalization, modernization movement, that we see in the way that police training happens in the field. And then that gets imported into courts and recycled by judicial decisions, endorsing that that's acceptable for future use. So, factors like this person is in a high crime area, scholars like Jeffrey Fagan did a study in New York City finding that the police basically said every neighborhood was a high crime area at some point or another. And so but yet that has currency in court, And that becomes the justification for eroding our Fourth Amendment rights. And that erosion happens particularly in neighborhoods that are saturated by the police, which also have this racial overtone. So just my little editorializing for a moment, but I think that's a kind of critical legal view of whether our constitutional rights actually protect us and how they can be eroded even in the existing frameworks. We've got time for more questions, so keep them coming. Sorry, Julia, did you want to respond to that?
No, that's great. That's really helpful. I got to read that. Thank you for that. That's great.
Yeah. Natalie Anderson had a couple of questions. So Natalie, I'm going to find you and allow you to unmute and ask your question. There are two Natalie Andersons here, so hopefully I'm picking the right one. If you can't unmute on that one, we'll see, and I'll try the other. Natalie, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Hi.
Yes.
For Natalie Anderson, I'm asking on her behalf here.
Terrific.
So just a couple. I think there were more than one question. So do I just combine them, or do you think there's another one?
Your favorite. Pick your favorite.
Okay. All right. So I guess my question has to do with does the addition of minorities to the police force, does that in any way incentivize the type of change that we're kind of thinking should happen? Or is it just a situation where there has to just be this wholesale dismantling of the police apparatus in order to really get to the change that we hope can happen?
That's a great question. I think, again, as a sociologist, I would like to see more data on this, but I would say two things. One, most of the colonial forces were manned by, and they were manned by local native forces, and it really didn't make a difference, right? So, and the anecdotally, bringing in more racialized minorities as police officers doesn't seem to me to change anything. Again, because it's the culture, it's the institution, it's the whole structure of the system that is what's causing people to behave the way they do. It's not their own, racial identity or something like that. So I know that, again, that's I again, it's for me, it's about the institution, right? And not the particular individuals per se.
Okay. Can I just get 1 second quick one in there? The
Go
other
for
question
it.
that I have real quick is would removing from a systemic standpoint, trying to bring change from external pressure through, for example, removing through legislation, let's say police immunity or civil liability for abuse and whatnot, do you think that's an angle and approach that could help to move things along in a sort of incentivize change in that direction? Or do you think that's such a hard thing to really get done, or it wouldn't really affect the sort of structural things that are part of the police system anyway? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so actually, the other thing that got me interested in militarization was how in the Obama era there were moves from both Democrats and Republicans to stop the arming of police, or stopping the ability of police to get military equipment, right? And this military surplus equipment, to stop those programs. And that's a fine thing to do, but it doesn't change the fact that police are already militarized. This is my way of answering any of these things. Again, they're just, again, from my perspective, I don't see them as making fundamental change. I don't think these kinds of changes are worthless, but my concern is always that these little kinds of changes or these little reforms end up sort of taking up the air for the real deeper kinds of changes that we should be focusing on, which is really about slowly putting more resources into other ways of stopping society's problems rather than just policing and then tinkering with the police. Again, I can't stress enough that I think what's happened is that society generates all these problems. I think capitalism generates all these problems, and we've decided to try to fix those problems by police as an institution. So anything that just sort of continues to perpetuate that mentality, which would include, let's fix these laws, things to prevent police from maybe doing a little bit more, try to stop them from doing more violence and so on, or let's maybe take away some of their military equipment and so on. These little things might have some short-term effect on some amount of things the police do, but it's not going to fundamentally change the problem. So that would be my answer. Again, I think that I'm much more of an institutionalist, right? I'm much more of a thinking on those levels. So I am, look at, police body cams, which, that was a major reform. It didn't stop much violence, right? Even these things, again, if you just look at the history of reform after reform after reform, you see that it's really a deeper problem, and we need to sort of think bigger. Again, I don't want to discount these efforts. They're worthwhile, but I always want to keep those efforts in a broader canvas of deeper change.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Next up, we've got a question from Rebecca Prees. Rebecca, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's incredibly stimulating. I am a mental health professional, and there is a strong movement, I work in Massachusetts, to, I would say, make the police more therapeutic. in their interventions. And there's a great emphasis in educating them about mental health practice and trauma, and using them as first responders in domestic violence cases, and or for a person experiencing a major mental health crisis. And I think you've just sort of answered that you see that as kind of a I don't know, frosting on the cake kind of a myth's wrong metaphor, but it doesn't get to the structure that you're talking about, uh, right? But it's like, so I'd like to hear your thoughts
Yeah,
about that.
yeah,
Is
yeah.
there any, yeah, should we abandon those things?
That's a fantastic question. I think that's a really interesting example because ultimately, I think that what those moves are doing, this case of making the police more, a little bit more attentive to performing these other functions, right? Which we know is the problem, right? So much of the police violence occurs because they're dealing with mental health problems, which gets at, my larger point, like why are we having the police deal with mental health, society's mental health? So on the one hand, I think it's a good thing because it's maybe, it's forcing the institution to pause and say, well, maybe things should be done a little bit differently. But I'm skeptical of it because it's the police that are being retrained. Like, I think that why not create an alternative unit altogether that is not the police, so to speak. And I fear that just giving police that and trying to train them is not quite, it's just another way of perpetuating the police and its budget, right? So I think that there's positives and negatives to that. Again, I'm worried that these moves are band-aids that police can say, well, we're dealing with this mental health thing, right? So I would really want to see true alternatives. My colleague here, Robert Vargas, is doing, and some of our students are doing a fantastic set of studies about why some departments well, cities are actually creating these alternative routes. And the key is that it really shouldn't be the police doing it. I think it's an okay first start, but again, we have to, because in the meantime, until we get the proper structure up to deal with mental health issues, maybe it has to be the police. But I think that the goal has to be to not have the police do that kind of stuff anymore.
So we could see it as a transitional stage.
Yes, as long as it's kept as a transitional stage and not as a look, we're doing it. This is good.
Yeah.
Get off our
It's
back.
not an end
Right?
point.
It's not an end point at all. I think that yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have a question from Kathleen Logan Smith. Kathleen, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Can you hear me? Sorry about that.
Yes, we can. No.
So my question is just what I've seen on juries is that they can't seem to convict police even when the evidence is there for a conviction, and it just doesn't happen. And I wonder if that's a national thing or if that's just a St. Louis thing.
Yeah, I don't. Katie, do you know this? I mean, I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about that.
I think my broad answer is twofold. One, there's the kind of broader, well, three, I have 3 points. One, there's the broader culture, right, of deference to law enforcement expertise. And then, so I think even though there are kind of like jury instructions typically in cases about law enforcement violence, that there is still a sort of cultural impression that the police need some wiggle room to do the challenging work that may involve violence in their job, right? So that is part of the way the law is structured. The other thing is that the rules around use of force in the law, again, the police have a different, the rules that govern police violence are different than the rules that govern the rest of us. The police are allowed to use typically, or any law enforcement, including correctional officials in prisons and jails, including lots of settings where violence is an endorsed part of the job. Typically, those professionals are allowed to use one stage of violence beyond that which they're facing. And so the other thing is that then whether they perceive a true threat and are responding with an appropriate level of force is a subjective standard based on a reasonable police officer rather than a reasonable person or something like that, right? So it is considered, the law would consider any reasonableness standard an objective standard, but really when you make it a reasonable police officer, that's importing some subjectivity about law enforcement culture into that, right? So I would say that there's structural problems in the standards that govern police behavior. And then there's kind of like cultural jury problems of just the general impressions that jurors have about law enforcement discretion and how police need to be able to do their jobs. And then there's the third piece is that our juries are not always representative of the communities in which they're supposed to be representative, right? We have Sixth Amendment problems of fair cross-section rights for jurors all the time as a structural matter. And there are certain groups of people that are functionally excluded from jury service, right? Including typically people who have connections to having been policed themselves, having negative encounters with law enforcement, right? And so if you're sectioning out people who have that life experience from being able to be jurors in cases, that is functionally creating, prefiguring kind of the range of experiences of how people view what the officers have done in a particular case. So those are some of the dynamics I think that are involved in why criminal cases end up not producing convictions of law enforcement. I think it's my critical view is that the law isn't actually interested in that at a structural level. And so it is the very rare case where prosecution results in conviction in the case of even egregious police violence, even police murder. And that is not by accident, right? The fact that we see that pattern over and over again, it means that it's by design. And there are lots of people who are smarter than me who have written extensively about those dynamics. And I'll try to drop some links before we close out.
Thanks for taking that one. Sorry, I couldn't.
Yeah, no
and, I mean,
problem.
my only answer, my only way of thinking about this again is like the big sociologist thing. So I apologize, but I think that the way juries make decisions, I think reflects one of the key ideological components that I'm talking about. I've talked about a lot of key ideological components. The other is that this image of the police as inherently good and inherent, right? And we have all this whole cop show. We have all this whole culture with cop shows. I love cop shows. They all create this like image of the police is inherently good, and there's a couple bad guys, and get rid of the bad guys, and the police get rid of the bad apple story, which is so ingrained in us. So I just wonder the extent to which juries reflect this larger inherent trust that society has of policing until I think maybe recently, right?
100%, yes. And that is absolutely a part of the story too, right? That yes, jurors are coming into the room with this cultural impression that we get from shows like CSI and Law and Order, and right, that this is a culturally coded, we talked about the culture of militarization and colonialism within police agencies, but there's also the broader societal culture of the way that that we are taught to see from very young ages, from Paw Patrol, right, of the police as our friends who are doing the work of the good. And I think when you start to unpack what's really happening and how do the communities that are most policed, I feel about policing in their neighborhoods, that's a really important set of different perspectives that aren't always given the table. So thank you for that. I do want to, we're at time. I'm going to mention Josh's question because it was a theme throughout the conversation, but I also think it's not necessarily your area of expertise, which is in part why I held it. But the first question we got tonight was from my colleague Josh Dinkoff at Citizens for Juvenile Justice, which is a local organization here in Massachusetts that does a lot of work around policing. And he said, could you comment on the applicability of the civil-military distinction for policing and the claimed distinction between civil and criminal immigration enforcement now in the US and the use of municipal police in those efforts?
Yeah, it's not exactly my area. And again, one of the things is that I think each city is so different the way they're handling this. So I don't know if there's a uniform answer. Right. It's probably the one thing I will say is that, I mean, what's so scary to me about Trump is that he's trying to overcome all of the local law enforcement. I mean, this creation of this unit within the National Guard. He's proposing to create this. I think he did create this. We don't know, but it is exactly a national colonial counterinsurgency tactical patrol force, but in control by Trump, right? And not by my mayor Brandon Johnson or whatever. So this is what's so scary to me. That's the kind of things that I'm worried about. Are these other distinctions? Yeah, it's Katie. I don't know if you want to answer that, but
Yeah,
I
I'll
do
just
think,
say,
yeah.
borrowing from your work, I think part of what your work teaches us, right, is that this idea of the criminal, right, this kind of eugenics idea that comes from old threads of criminology too, right, it is implicit in the way that the political rhetoric and the actual functioning on the ground of these deployments is happening, right? That immigrants are being criminalized without actually necessarily having any criminal background. And so we're seeing a collapse, in my view, between the civil and the criminal, and the idea that armed agents of the state are responding to people who have committed only a legally civil violation. That's a criminal and militarized response, right? So we can say that it is civil in nature, but the reality, the felt reality for people who are experiencing that, and for people who are afraid to leave their homes or send their children to school, is that they are being criminalized, and it's because of identity. That's how I would respond.
So can I just add, the institutional part of that story is that there's a reason why we end up treating what these civil, because it's just a civil offense to enter illegally, right? I mean, that's so. But the way we treat it as criminal, and then in this militarized way, is reflective of the way in which we instituted institutionally, structurally, systematically, and mentally the notion that the only way to deal with problems, civil or criminal, is actually it's this militarist colonialist solution. And I think that's reflective of this smashing of the divide is, I think, between the civil. I think that might be partly also a reflection of all we have are hammers, and so everything is a nail, right? And so these finer distinctions don't apply, and they're kind of useless, actually.
That's right. Yeah. Well, on that bleak note, I guess we can say a big thank you for sharing your time with us today and your expertise. And thank you for participating in the series. And if folks haven't read Julian's book, please go find it. And we'll be back in 2 weeks for our next event in the series. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Bye. Goodbye, everyone.